Snow fell like forgotten ash over the Oregon Ridge, where time itself seemed to breathe through the stones. Marcus Brennan's hands cracked from years of labor on highway repair crews trembled as he unfolded the yellow legal document. A house carved into the mountain left by the aunt he barely remembered. Beside him, Sentinel, his 7-year-old German shepherd, lifted his head, ears twitching toward the cliffs as if hearing an ancient voice calling them home. They didn't know the place was more than a shelter. It was a message carved in silence, a legacy waiting to be heard. Marcus Brennan came to Oregon to disappear. At 43, his body carried the quiet heaviness of a man who had seen war and then lived through the quieter kind that follows survival without purpose. His square, weathered face was lined by sun and regret, dark brown hair threaded with silver at the temples, a rough beard trimmed close to his jaw. His eyes, gray-blue like winter steel, held the kind of distance that came from watching good men die because of orders you gave. He wore a thick olive field jacket, its elbows worn through and patched the collar frayed from seasons of cold labor. A faded red and navy flannel shirt showed beneath, paired with cargo pants, the color of dried moss, and brown leather boots that had walked too many miles. On his left wrist, an old military watch ticked quietly, keeping time he no longer cared to measure. He lived in his truck now, a rusted Ford F-150 parked on the shoulder of Highway 26, hidden behind a stand of Douglas fir where the road crew rarely checked. Inside the cab smelled of coffee, diesel, and the particular loneliness of a man who had stopped trying to explain himself. Every morning before dawn, he woke to the sound of Sentinel's breathing steady and calm beside him. The dog never complained, never asked why they lived this way. He simply existed in the present, a skill Marcus had lost somewhere between Helmand Province and home. The letter had arrived 3 days ago, left on his windshield by someone who shouldn't have known where he slept. Brown paper, his name written in clean official script. Inside, a single page from the law office of Robert Nash, attorney at law in Clearfield, Oregon. The words were simple, almost cruel in their brevity. Mr. Brennan, we regret to inform you of the passing of your Aunt Louise Brennan. As her last living relative, you have inherited her property located at Silver Ridge, Parcel 14B, formerly known as the Brennan Homestead. Please contact our office for arrangements. Louise. The name brought back fragments, the smell of pine tar soap, the way she hummed old hymns while cooking, her hands always moving, always working. She had lived alone on that mountain for as long as Marcus could remember, the kind of woman small towns whispered about, but secretly admired. He hadn't seen her in 22 years, not since he was 21 and shipping out for his first deployment. She had given him a compass, then brass and heavy with words engraved on the back. True north isn't a place. It's a choice. He still had it buried somewhere in the duffel bag that held everything he owned. That night, memories flickered like weak firelight. He had returned from Afghanistan 12 years ago, carrying the weight of faces he couldn't save. Cooper, Sergeant Daniel Cooper, 26 years old, who died because Marcus hesitated when he should have acted. The firefight in Kandahar had lasted 7 minutes. Cooper, bleeding out in the sand, had taken 40. Since then, everything had been noise. Work, sleep, repeat. The world never asked if he wanted quiet. It simply gave it to him until it became suffocating. He stared out the window, snowflakes melting on the glass like ghosts pressing their fingers against the pane. Sentinel whined softly, sensing his unease. The dog had a way of knowing when Marcus's mind went dark, when the desert came back in flashes of heat and screaming. You think it's worth going? Marcus asked. His voice was rough, unused to conversation. Sentinel's ears perked up, and he tilted his head as if to say yes, as if to say anything is better than this truck, this shoulder, this slow erasure. By noon, Marcus drove into Clearfield. The streets were narrow and wind-bent, lined with closed shops and salt-streaked windows. At the corner stood the law office of Robert Nash, a low brick building with a wooden sign faded from decades of rain. Inside, the warmth smelled of dust and old paper, the kind of smell that suggested nothing had changed here in 50 years. Robert Nash himself stood behind a desk stacked with the manila folders. He was in his late 60s, tall and angular, with a neatly combed sweep of white hair and wire-rimmed glasses that made his pale blue eyes seem perpetually surprised. His tweed jacket hung loosely on narrow shoulders, giving him the look of a scholar misplaced in a lumber town. Mr. Brennan, Nash said, extending a hand that felt colder than the air outside. Thank you for coming on such short notice. I didn't expect you'd make the drive in this weather. Marcus nodded, his voice low. You said it was urgent. Nash's expression flickered, something like sympathy crossing his face. Not urgent, perhaps, he replied, but important. Miss Louise was quite particular about her affairs. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside was the deed, a set of GPS coordinates, and a faded photograph of a small stone house nestled against a cliffside, snow blanketing its roof like a shroud. The property hadn't been occupied for over 3 decades, Nash continued. Louise had instructed that it be left untouched until passed to Marcus. No explanations, no conditions, just the house, the land, and whatever secrets she had kept there. Marcus frowned, studying the photograph. Why me? We weren't close. The attorney gave a small, knowing smile. Family doesn't always choose closeness, Mr. Brennan. Sometimes it leaves you puzzles instead. When Marcus stepped back into the cold, Sentinel trotted close, tail brushing against his leg. Snow had started falling again, thick and silent. The photograph in Marcus's hand trembled slightly under the wind. The house looked small, almost swallowed by the mountain behind it. But there was something magnetic in its isolation, something that pulled at the part of him that had been running for 12 years. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe loneliness. He tucked the paper into his jacket and looked down at Sentinel. Silver Ridge, huh? You up for a trip? The dog barked once, sharp and decisive, like a soldier confirming an order. That night, they parked by the edge of the forest road leading towards Silver Ridge. The world was still but not empty. Pines groaned beneath snow's weight, and wind threaded through their branches like a warning. Marcus built a small fire beside the truck light, flickering across his face, revealing tired eyes that still held a stubborn spark. He watched Sentinel lie beside the flame's muzzle, resting on his paws, eyes half closed yet alert. Somewhere beneath the mountain shadow, a faint hum rose too low for human ears, but Sentinel lifted his head, ears pointing toward the dark slope. The dog's body tensed, muscles coiled with focus. Marcus frowned. What is it, boy? Sentinel didn't bark this time. He simply stared at the mountain, his breath fogging in the cold, a quiet growl vibrating in his chest. Marcus followed his gaze, seeing nothing but snow and trees. Yet the air felt different, heavy, watching. He rubbed his hands together near the fire, unease, gnawing at the edge of thought. You're jumpy tonight, he muttered, though the words carried little conviction. The dog didn't move. Only when Marcus placed a hand on his back did Sentinel exhale and settle again reluctantly. The night stretched long, filled with the sound of crackling wood and distant wind, an old sound that seemed to carry something deeper, almost human. By dawn, the fire had died. Marcus awoke to find frost covering the inside of the truck windows, painting delicate veins of ice across the glass. He started the engine, staring at the mountain through the windshield, its peak lost in low clouds. All right, he said, voice a whisper meant only for Sentinel. Let's see what she left us. The German shepherd turned his head, eyes steady and bright in the morning light, as if he already knew what waited beyond the ridge was more than inheritance. It was the beginning of something buried, something calling. Together they set out into the white silence of the mountain road. The snow deepened as Marcus's truck wound its way through the narrow pass. The tires groaned, spinning against the ice before the engine gave a tired cough and went still. A hollow silence followed, broken only by the wind dragging snow across the road in long, whispering streaks. Marcus sat behind the wheel for a moment, breathing slowly, his gloved hands resting on the steering wheel. The ridge loomed ahead, Silver Ridge, its upper slopes veiled in mist and shadow. Beside him, Sentinel raised his head, amber eyes fixed on the white distance. The dog's breath fogged the window ears and twitching towards something Marcus couldn't hear. Looks like we walk from here, Marcus muttered. Sentinel barked once, sharp and affirmative, then pushed his weight against the door, ready. They packed only what they needed: food, a military-grade flashlight, a thick wool blanket, and Marcus's old duffel bag containing the compass Louise had given him. The air bit through their clothes as they stepped into the storm. Snow reached Marcus's calves, heavy and stubborn. Each step was a negotiation with gravity. Sentinel trotted ahead, his black and tan fur glinting with frost, moving with the efficient economy of a working dog who had never been a pet. The trail narrowed, winding upward through pines that leaned under the weight of accumulated snow. Ravens circled above their cries, brief and distant, swallowed quickly by the white. Halfway up the ridge, Marcus stopped to catch his breath, leaning against a fallen trunk. His knees ached, the old injury from an IED blast and helmet flaring again. Still think this was a good idea, he asked. Sentinel turned back, tail wagging, once the kind of simple answer that left no room for retreat. By midday, the storm eased into a gray calm. The world around them seemed frozen mid-breath, as if the mountain itself had paused to observe these two intruders. Smoke rose faintly from a chimney ahead, an unexpected sign of life. Following the smell of wood fire, Marcus and Sentinel reached a small cabin by a bend in the road. Outside, a man in his late 50s was splitting firewood with deliberate rhythm. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick gray beard and deep-set hazel eyes that carried both caution and curiosity. His flannel shirt was torn at one sleeve, revealing a forearm crisscrossed with old scars, and his movements were careful, almost too measured for a simple woodsman. He looked up when he saw them, the axe pausing mid-swing. "You're not from around here," he said, voice gravelly yet even. "Road's been closed 3 days. Nobody climbs Silver Ridge in this weather." Marcus shifted the weight of his pack. Truck broke down, trying to reach an old property up ahead, Brennan Homestead. The man froze for a beat before lowering his axe. "Brennan, you say, His tone softened slightly. "Name's Augustus Stone. Folks around here call me Gus. Used to run supplies for the forestry camp before it shut down." He motioned toward his cabin. "Come in, warm up. Storm's not done yet." Inside, the warmth hit like a tide. The air smelled of pine resin and venison stew simmering on a cast-iron stove. The cabin was modest, handmade furniture, an old map of the ridge pinned to the wall, and a few photographs of a younger Gus standing beside logging trucks. He poured coffee into tin mugs and slid one toward Marcus. His hands, though rough, moved with a craftsman's precision. Sentinel lay near the firehead on his paws, watching everything with quiet alertness. "You said Brennan?" Gus asked again, sitting across from Marcus. "That place has been empty longer than I've been here. People say it's cursed, though I don't buy into that. Just strange things, you know." He tapped the side of his mug thoughtfully. "Voices, mostly. When the snow hits right, the ridge hums like water under stone. Locals call it the mountain talking." Marcus gave a half smile. "Sounds like wind finding cracks in the rock." Gus shrugged, his eyes distant. "Maybe, but one winter, a hiker went missing near there. They never found him. Only his pack washed clean, like it had been left in a river that never froze." The words sat heavy between them, like stones dropped into still water. Marcus finished his coffee and stood. "Appreciate the shelter, Gus. We'll make it before dark." Gus hesitated, then nodded slowly. "If you reach the ridge before sunset, follow the old telegraph line. It'll lead straight to the cliff path." He paused, his eyes lingering on Marcus with something that looked like concern. "And Brennan the mountain keeps its own kind of memory. Don't push too hard to understand it." The warning lingered even after Marcus and Sentinel stepped back into the snow. The light had changed. The world had gone from gray to silver, the ridge shimmering faintly in the distance like something out of a dream. Sentinel walked ahead again, nose to the ground, tail low and focused. The wind carried faint murmurs, nothing clear, just the rise and fall of tone, like breath caught between stone. Marcus told himself it was imagination. He focused on the rhythm of his boots and Sentinel's paws, the crunch of snow, their only answer to the mountain silence. An hour later, as dusk bled into the horizon, they reached a ledge overlooking the valley below. The trail dipped sharply, and beyond it, against the cliffside, Marcus saw it. A stone structure half buried in snow, clinging to the rock as if carved from the mountain itself. The Brennan homestead. Its roof sagged under ice and the window panes glowed faintly with reflected light from the setting sun, giving the house an eerie, watchful quality. Marcus stopped, his breath visible in the frigid air. "We made it," he whispered. Sentinel gave a low bark, circling once before sitting beside him, eyes locked on the house. Something about the silence unsettled Marcus. It wasn't emptiness, it was listening. The air seemed to vibrate low and steady, a sound felt more than heard, like the deep hum of machinery buried far underground. Sentinel tilted his head, ears pricked forward, then emitted a single soft whine. The mountain, as Gus had said, seemed alive. Marcus tightened his grip on the pack strap, forcing a laugh that carried no humor. "Let's get inside before we freeze." He started down the slope, snow crunching beneath his boots. Behind him, Sentinel followed close, his gaze never leaving the shadowed shape of the old house, as if it were watching them arrive. The last of the daylight clung to the ridge as Marcus and Sentinel reached the house. It looked smaller than in the photograph, half buried under layers of snow, its wooden frame fused to the black basalt wall behind it, as if the mountain had decided to claim it slowly over the decades. The structure leaned slightly forward, the front porch sagging under the weight of time and weather. Moss and frost coated the boards, and one shutter hung crookedly, knocking softly in the wind like a patient, persistent ghost. Marcus stood still for a long moment, studying it. The place radiated both endurance and sorrow, like something that had waited too long to be remembered. He brushed frost from an old wooden sign nailed near the doorframe. The faint carved letters read, "Brennan Homestead, 1956. Sentinel padded closer, tail low, nose quivering as he sniffed the air around the entrance. His breath steamed against the cold wood as a soft rumble built deep in his throat, not fear exactly, but recognition of something unfamiliar. Marcus tried the front door. The handle resisted, frozen and stubborn, before giving way with a dry groan that echoed through the empty rooms beyond. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of dust-damp pine and rusted metal, the smell of abandonment. His boots creaked against warped floorboards as he stepped in, sweeping his flashlight across the narrow room. A stone hearth filled with old ashes dominated one wall. A small wooden table sat covered in yellowed newspapers, their headlines faded and meaningless now. Shelves sagged under the weight of forgotten glass jars and rusted tools. Against the far wall hung a faded tapestry depicting a river flowing between mountains, its blue thread still vibrant despite the years. She really lived here, Marcus murmured, running a hand over the surface of the table, feeling the grain of the wood beneath decades of dust. He imagined Louise's hands the same bloodlines shaping wood and survival in the quiet heart of nowhere. The thought was both comforting and deeply sad. Sentinel moved restlessly through the room, circling twice before stopping near the corner where the floorboards darkened slightly, as though the wood had been replaced at some point. He sniffed intently, whined once, and scratched at the boards with his paw. Marcus frowned and knelt beside him. "What is it, boy?" He tapped one board experimentally and heard a hollow echo beneath. A hidden space. He fetched a small pry bar from his pack and worked it gently into the seam. The board lifted with a reluctant sigh of old nails pulling free. Beneath it was a wooden trapdoor, iron latch streaked with rust and age. The air rising through the gap was colder still and dry and ancient, carrying the faint smell of minerals and stone. Sentinel stiffened, ears forward, hackles raised slightly, but not in fear. It was as if he recognized something in that scent, something his instincts told him to respect. Marcus hesitated, memories surfacing unbidden. The tunnels in Afghanistan, the weight of darkness pressing against the skin, the sense that the earth itself held its breath, waiting. He shook it off and tried the latch. It wouldn't budge, locked tight by rust and time. "Figures," he muttered. In the corner of the room, an old wooden toolbox sat half open, its contents scattered. Inside were screws, nails, a broken tape measure, and a small brass key coated in grime. He wiped it clean on his sleeve, the metal catching the dim light, then tried it in the lock. The latch clicked softly, a sound that seemed too loud in the stillness. For a second, nothing happened. Then as Marcus pulled, the trapdoor gave way, opening to reveal a narrow stone staircase descending into blackness. A breath of cold air rose from below, brushing his face like invisible fingers, carrying with it that same mineral scent and something else, something faintly metallic and alive. "Stay close," Marcus whispered. Sentinel answered with a low growl, his body tense but ready, and followed without hesitation as Marcus began the descent. The flashlight beam wavered on the stone walls as they went down. The stairs were carved directly into the mountain, their edges worn smooth by decades of use, perhaps centuries. Halfway down, Marcus paused, noticing symbols etched faintly into the basalt. Circles intersecting lines, patterns resembling water currents or veins. The marks were deliberate, old, but precise, as if someone had spent years carving them with care and purpose. "Did she carve these?" Marcus murmured to himself. His voice came back to him, doubled as though the mountain itself answered, echoing his words in a way that made them sound like a question from someone else. At the bottom lay a small chamber, no larger than a garden shed. The ceiling curved inward, lined with wooden beams blackened by moisture and age. Against one wall sat a desk built directly into the stone, its surface covered in notebooks, glass jars filled with mineral samples, and what appeared to be pieces of broken equipment, coils of copper wire, a cracked headset, a small metal box labeled in faded ink, Signal Receiver Type 2. Dust blanketed everything, yet nothing seemed decayed beyond recognition. It was as though the air itself preserved the room, keeping it suspended in time. A wooden chair stood pushed back from the desk as if someone had just risen and stepped away moments ago. On the wall above the desk hung a photograph in a simple wooden frame. A woman in her 50s with kind, sharp eyes and windblown hair streaked with silver. She wore a wool coat and stood beside the very cabin Marcus had just entered, her expression serious but not unkind. Marcus felt something twist in his chest, a mixture of grief and recognition. "Hello, Aunt Louise," he whispered. Sentinel padded over to the far side of the room where a narrow crack split the stone floor. From it came a faint vibration, steady and rhythmic, like distant water running deep underground or the slow pulse of something alive. The sound rose and fell in irregular waves, not loud but unmistakable once noticed. The dog lowered his head, listening intently, his ears swiveling to track the source. Marcus knelt beside him, pressing his palm flat against the cold stone. The tremor was real, pulsing faintly beneath the surface, a living heartbeat within the mountain. He looked around the chamber, spotting a coil of copper wire leading from the receiver box toward the crack in the floor. Louise had been recording it, whatever it was, measuring it, trying to understand it. On the edge of the desk, Marcus found a leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed and brittle. The handwriting matched the neat script he had seen in the letter from the lawyer's office. He opened it carefully, the spine cracking softly. The first entry was dated December 9th, 1961. The ridge still speaks. The sound changes with the weather never ceasing. Not wind, not water. Something alive beneath the rock. Marcus flipped through the pages, each entry more urgent than the last. Notes about pressure changes, about the rhythm accelerating during storms and slowing during droughts. Sketches of the symbols carved into the walls. References to old geological surveys that had dismissed her findings. And then near the end, an entry dated only 1 week before her death. The mountain grows restless. If you find this, listen. It remembers. Marcus closed the book, his heart pounding with a strange mix of dread and awe. He glanced at Sentinel, who was now sitting perfectly still, eyes fixed on the crack, as if waiting for something to emerge. The faint rumble deepened for a moment, then faded again into near silence, leaving only the suggestion of presence of something vast and patient beneath their feet. Marcus stood sweeping the flashlight across the chamber once more. The air felt thicker now, the shadows longer and more deliberate. He reached down and rested a hand on Sentinel's neck, feeling the dog's warmth and solidity. "Let's go up," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. The dog hesitated, gaze still locked on the stone, as if reluctant to leave whatever secret lay beneath. Then slowly he rose and followed Marcus back toward the stairs. As they climbed back to the main floor, Marcus felt the faint tremor still echoing in his bones, a rhythm that seemed to sync with his own heartbeat. The mountain wasn't just holding the house, it was breathing with it. When he closed the trapdoor, the sound vanished almost instantly, replaced by the quiet hum of wind outside and the creak of old wood settling. He leaned against the wall, the flashlight flickering low as the batteries began to fade. In the dim light, Marcus whispered into the stillness, "What were you trying to tell me, Louise?" Sentinel lay down beside him, tail thumping once before curling close. His amber eyes remained open and alert, as if expecting an answer from the mountain itself. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose shutter against the frame. Snow began to fall again, heavier now, covering their tracks and sealing them into this strange, quiet place where the past and present seemed to breathe together. Part 2, The Living Water. Morning light filtered weakly through the cracked windows, turning the frost on the glass into slow-moving rivers of silver. Marcus woke in the old chair near the hearth, his back aching from the night spent in an awkward position. Sentinel lifted his head beside him, tail flicking once before he stretched, yawning wide. The trapdoor under the floorboards remained sealed, yet Marcus could still sense the faint pulse he had felt last night, like the earth itself was breathing somewhere deep below. He poured coffee from his thermos into a tin mug, the steam curling into the cold air, and stared at the notebook he had left open on the table. Louise's handwriting trailed off mid-sentence in that final entry, as though she had been interrupted. The words, "it remembers," were still circling in his mind when a sound came from outside. Not wind, not snow falling from branches. The deliberate crunch of boots on frozen ground. Marcus grabbed his jacket and stepped onto the porch to find a woman standing near the base of the steps brushing snow from a wool hat. She was in her mid-60s, tall and lean, wearing a heavy brown parka, dusted white with fresh snow. Her hair steel gray and pulled back in a practical bun framed a face weathered by years of field work. Her eyes, a sharp hazel behind wire-rimmed glasses, studied Marcus with the kind of quiet curiosity that suggested she already knew more than she was letting on. "You must be Marcus Brennan," she said, her voice firm but not unfriendly. "I'm Dr. Judith Warren. I worked with the USGS before I retired. The county sheriff mentioned someone had reopened this property. I had to come see for myself." She extended a gloved hand. Marcus hesitated before shaking it. Her grip was steady, confident, the kind of handshake that belonged to someone used to climbing cliffs and handling delicate instruments in harsh weather. Inside, as they warmed their hands near the dying embers of the fire Marcus had built the night before Judith explained her purpose. For weeks, ground sensors near Silver Ridge had been picking up anomalies. Rhythmic vibrations, she called them, like pressure waves moving through solid rock. "Your property sits right on the center line," she said, pulling a folded printout from her bag. The data showed regular pulses, each one separated by intervals that varied with barometric pressure and precipitation. "It's not seismic activity, it's something else, something I've never seen before." Marcus poured her coffee, saying nothing yet. Sentinel sniffed the air around her, then settled by the door, watchful but calm. Judith noticed the dog and smiled faintly. "He's beautiful. Shepherd, right?" Marcus nodded. 7 years old, best company I've had in a while. Judith's smile deepened slightly. Smart eyes. Dogs sense things before we do, especially here. Her tone carried a note of professional unease that made Marcus look up. What do you mean especially here? Judith set down her mug and met his gaze directly. Your Aunt Louise Brennan, she contacted the USGS back in 1994 with data about subsurface water movement beneath this ridge. She claimed to have discovered what she called a living aquifer, a pressurized water source that responded to environmental changes like a biological system. We dismissed it. No peer review, no academic credentials. Just a woman alone on a mountain with homemade equipment. We were wrong to ignore her. Marcus felt the weight of those words settle into the room. He led Judith down to the cellar, helping her navigate the narrow stairs. There's something underneath, he said quietly. I found old equipment and sounds, not wind, something else. Judith crouched at the base of the trapdoor, her fingers brushing the seams between the boards, with the reverence of an archaeologist uncovering a fragile artifact. If the mountain's moving internally, we need to know why, she murmured. Together they opened the door again. The same chill rose from below, sharper than before, carrying that mineral scent Marcus was beginning to recognize. They descended together, the beam of Judith's high-powered flashlight cutting through the darkness more effectively than Marcus's old military light. She paused on the stairs to study the markings carved into the basalt. These are geological symbols, she said, tracing one circle with her finger, her voice tinged with awe. But some don't belong to any modern code I recognize. Your aunt was mapping subterranean flow lines, trying to create a visual language for something science hadn't named yet. At the bottom, Judith moved toward the crack in the floor, where Sentinel now stood again, his body taut, ears pinned forward in that same posture of alert recognition. The sound was there, faint but alive, like the deep murmur of shifting water far below the Earth's surface. Judith knelt, pressing a small handheld seismometer against the stone. The device beeped softly, lights pulsing green as it registered the vibrations. There's movement, she whispered, her voice barely audible. A steady flow about 40 meters down. That's not groundwater. It's too regular, too strong, and the pressure signature is unlike anything in the geological record. She glanced up at Marcus, her eyes wide behind her glasses. Your aunt called it the blue line, didn't she? Marcus blinked, surprised. You know about that? Judith nodded slowly. I read her papers once years ago after she stopped trying to contact us. She was brilliant, unconventional, but brilliant. She believed this ridge held a living aquifer, one that changed rhythm like a heartbeat. Everyone laughed at her until the recording stopped. Marcus felt the weight of her words settle between them like a stone. She wrote that if it stopped, the valley would die, he said quietly. Judith stood, brushing dust from her gloves, and turned her attention to the wall behind the desk. She tapped it twice with her knuckles. The echo that came back was not sharp, but deep, resonant, as though a large chamber lay beyond. These stones are hollow, she said, her voice rising with excitement. Sentinel barked suddenly, a sharp sound that made both of them jump. He backed up a step, his eyes fixed on the wall. Marcus grabbed his flashlight, and together he and Judith began to pry off one of the wooden panels that covered the lower section of the wall. Cold air rushed out as the panel came free, damp and metallic, smelling faintly of moss and deep water. A narrow opening appeared, just wide enough for a person to slip through if they turned sideways. Judith leaned closer, her breath visible in the sudden chill. That's not a natural cave, she murmured, awe creeping into her voice. It's shaped, man-made. Marcus raised the flashlight higher, letting the beam spill into the narrow gap. Beyond it, the stone curved in a perfect arc, the walls smooth as polished glass. And there, deep inside, a faint blue luminescence shimmered like light, refracting through water, pulsing gently in time with the vibrations beneath their feet. The hum grew louder as they stood there, vibrating through their boots and up into their chests. Sentinel whined softly but didn't retreat. Marcus looked at Judith, his voice barely a whisper. You think she found it? Judith shook her head slowly, her eyes wide and unblinking. No, she said, her voice filled with wonder and something close to fear. I think she built it. They stood in silence for a long moment, the blue light flickering gently in the darkness beyond the wall, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of their own. Marcus could feel his pulse syncing with the rhythm of the mountain, a sensation both terrifying and oddly comforting. Whatever Louise had discovered, whatever she had spent decades protecting and studying, was still here, still alive, still waiting. Snow melted along the lower slopes as Marcus drove down from the ridge the next morning, the truck's tires crunching over half-frozen gravel and slush. Beside him, Sentinel sat, alert, head resting on the window's edge, amber eyes scanning every passing turn as if memorizing the route back. The mountain loomed smaller in the rearview mirrors now, but it still felt close, as if watching him leave with patient, ancient eyes. In the passenger seat, Judith's notes lay spread open, covered in sketches of the glowing chamber diagrams of pressure readings and a photocopy of Louise's last journal page. The words "the ridge is being drained" were underlined twice in dark ink, as if Louise had pressed the pen hard enough to tear through to the truth beneath. Marcus's jaw tightened as he navigated the winding road. If someone was drilling into that mountain, it wasn't just greed, it was sabotage. It was murder in slow motion, the kind that left no bodies, only silence where life used to be. He reached the outskirts of Clearfield, where the snow thinned into wet mud and the dense pine forest gave way to brittle farmland and scattered houses. The mechanic shop on the corner still carried its rusted sign, Drummond Engineering and Pumps. Marcus parked out front and stepped inside, the smell of oil and stale coffee hitting him first familiar and oddly comforting. A tall man in his early 70s emerged from beneath a hoisted pickup, wiping his hands on a rag that looked like it had seen 1,000 oil changes. Silas Drummond had the rugged look of someone who had spent his life fixing what others broke. Square shoulders, a silver-streaked beard, and a faint limp from an old workplace injury that never quite healed right. His eyes were gray, watchful, with the kind of heaviness that came from keeping too many secrets for too many years. "Well, hell," Silas said when he saw Marcus, a slow smile spreading across his weathered face. "Didn't think I'd ever see another serviceman out here." "You still trying to save the world, Brennan?" Marcus returned the smile faintly. "Just the part that hasn't sunk yet." They shook hands, firm and respectful, the grip of men who understood that some things didn't need to be said aloud. Silas motioned toward a cluttered desk covered in blueprints and half-empty thermoses. "Coffee's hot. Tell me what you've got." Marcus spread the copied documents across the table, smoothing them with his palm. "These were found in my aunt's house up on Silver Ridge. She was tracking water movement, underground flow patterns. My friend Dr. Warren thinks it's connected to pressure shifts your old company might have caused." Silas's face froze at the mention, the color draining slightly. "Cascadia Water Solutions," Marcus added quietly, watching Silas's reaction. The older man exhaled slowly, pulling up a chair with a creak of old joints. "I used to be a part of their infrastructure division," Silas said, his voice low and careful. 5 years back, maybe 6 now. We built subsurface extraction wells supposed to be clean hydro storage for drought management. But it wasn't clean, and it wasn't storage." He paused, rubbing his knee absently, the old injury aching with the memory. "They found something beneath Silver Ridge. A pressurized flow source unlike any other. The geologists on contract called it a perpetual vein. Instead of studying it, the executives wanted to tap it. Quietly. No permits. No environmental impact statements. Just profits." Marcus leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. "You're saying they're drilling inside the mountain?" Silas nodded grimly, his eyes distant. "Already have. About 6 months ago, I saw a transfer order cross my desk. 3 trucks worth of bore rigs moved off the books. No permits, no environmental logs, no oversight. When I started asking questions, I was told to forget it or retire early. So I did both." He rubbed his knee again, a nervous habit. "If they keep pulling from that vein, it'll destabilize the whole ridge. Think of it like draining the spine from a living creature. Everything collapses." Marcus felt the air thicken around him, the walls of the small office seeming to close in. "That's exactly what's happening," he said quietly. "It's alive in there, and it's slowing down." Silas raised an eyebrow, his expression caught between disbelief and grim acceptance. "Alive." Marcus nodded. "Not in the way you think, more like it reacts, breathes, responds, and it's dying." Silence filled the workshop, broken only by the buzz of a fluorescent light overhead and the distant hum of traffic on the main road. Finally, Silas stood, moving to a filing cabinet in the corner. He pulled out a folder yellowed with age and handed it to Marcus. "If you're serious about stopping them, you'll need proof. There's an old service tunnel off Highway 9 near the abandoned lumber mill. Cascadia used it to move heavy rigs without drawing attention. It's still guarded, but you might find records there. Maintenance logs, drilling schedules, something concrete." As Marcus folded the documents carefully and tucked them into his jacket, Silas's tone softened. "Your aunt tried to expose them once, you know. She came to me for data access back in the 90s. Smart woman. Too brave for her own good." Marcus's gaze sharpened. "You knew her?" Silas nodded slowly, his eyes distant with memory. "She used to send me field recordings. Said the water sang back to her like it was trying to communicate. I thought she was crazy. Now I'm not so sure." When Marcus stepped back into the cold afternoon air, the sky had turned the color of slate heavy with the promise of more snow. Sentinel waited by the truck, his tail flicking once as he sensed the tension radiating from Marcus. Marcus ruffled the dog's fur absently, his mind already racing ahead. "We're not done yet, buddy." He slid into the driver's seat, the engine turning over with a reluctant cough. The headlights cut through the falling dusk as he pulled back onto the road, heading toward the one place he knew he had to go next. The drive back up toward the ridge was long and winding. Twilight blurred the tree line into black silhouettes against the sky the color of bruised plums. A single headlight appeared behind him after several miles too far back to be a coincidence, too steady to be a casual traveler. Marcus slowed, deliberately watching in the rearview mirror. The other vehicle slowed too, maintaining the same distance. His hand moved instinctively to the old revolver tucked under his seat, a habit he hadn't used since his last deployment, but never quite abandoned. "You see that?" he muttered. Though Sentinel was already growling softly, his hackles raised in response to the tension. When Marcus turned onto the narrow forest road leading back toward the cabin, the headlight vanished behind a curve swallowed by the trees. But the unease stayed coiling in his gut like a warning. By the time he reached Silver Ridge, night had fully claimed the sky. Snow began to fall again, quiet and slow, the flakes catching in the beams of his headlights. He parked the truck near the trail and killed the engine, sitting in the darkness for a moment listening. That's when he saw them. Faint tire tracks cutting through the fresh snow leading up the slope behind the cabin. Not his tracks, not Judith's. Someone else had been here. Recently. His stomach tightened. He stepped out carefully, motioning for Sentinel to stay low. The dog crouched beside him, body rigid, breath steady and controlled. Somewhere above, barely audible, came the soft sound of metal clicking, a door closing, or a weapon being chambered. Marcus approached the house with deliberate silence, his boots finding the packed snow where the sound would be muted. The porch light he had left off earlier now glowed faintly yellow, casting long shadows across the snow. He peeked through the window, his breath fogging the glass. The living room was dark except for the oil lantern he had left on the table, and beside it, weighing down a single sheet of white paper, was a smooth river stone. His chest tightened as he pushed the door open slowly, every muscle coiled and ready. Sentinel followed, ears pinned back, a low growl vibrating in his throat like a warning engine. The paper bore a corporate logo Marcus recognized from Silas's files, Cascadia Water Solutions. Below it, 4 words typed in neat black font: "Stop digging, stay quiet." A noise behind the cabin made Marcus spin his hand, going to the revolver, footsteps retreating fast into the trees. He darted outside, but the darkness and falling snow swallowed everything. Only Sentinel's barking echoed against the rock walls, sharp and furious, before fading into the vast silence of the mountain. The night fell quiet again, oppressively, so as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. Marcus knelt in the snow, running a hand through Sentinel's fur to calm both the dog and himself. "They know," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "They've been watching all along." The lantern flickered inside the cabin, throwing their shadows long and distorted across the walls. In that trembling light, Marcus could see the outlines of Louise's old maps still spread on the table, the blue line winding through the paper like a vein, like a lifeline, like a pulse that someone was trying to sever. The mountain wasn't just reacting anymore. It was warning them. And Marcus knew with the certainty that comes from years of combat that the real fight was just beginning. He stood slowly, his jaw set, his eyes hard. Sentinel looked up at him, waiting for the command, waiting for the decision that would determine everything. Marcus reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears, a gesture of comfort and resolve. "We're not running this time, boy. Not from this." The storm arrived 3 days later like a living thing, a white wall roaring down from the peaks, swallowing the ridge and the valley in one long breathless howl. By nightfall, the wind screamed through every crack of the cabin, shaking the shutters and moaning against the wooden beams with a voice that sounded almost human. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, erasing the world beyond the windows, until even the trees vanished into the white. Inside, the fire in the hearth flickered as though afraid, its light dancing nervously across the walls. Marcus paced the room, his boots creaking on the old floorboards, listening to the sound of the storm crawling over the roof like something alive and hunting. Sentinel lay near the door, ears twitching with every gust of wind, his body taut and ready. The dog's instincts had been restless all evening, his eyes darting to the windows as if tracking something beyond the dark that Marcus couldn't see. Marcus tried to read Louise's notebook again, but the words blurred in the lamplight, his thoughts circling back to the note Cascadia had left, the threat implicit in its brevity. Whoever had come here hadn't just been curious. They had wanted to make sure he stopped digging, stopped asking questions, stopped disturbing the carefully constructed silence that had covered this mountain for decades. He looked toward the ridge, invisible now in the storm, and wondered how many machines were still buried beneath that snow, drilling into the mountain's veins, draining it drop by drop until there was nothing left but silence and dust. Sentinel suddenly growled low, rising to his feet in one smooth motion. The hairs along his spine stood like quills, his eyes fixed on the door. "What is it, boy?" Marcus whispered, his hand moving instinctively to the revolver on the table. But before he could move, a distant sound cracked through the storm, cutting through the wind like a gunshot. A deep rolling boom that shook the floorboards beneath their feet. Then came another fainter but longer, like thunder trapped underground, reverberating through the stone and into Marcus's chest. He ran to the window, trying to see through the storm, but the snow was too thick, the night too complete. Then he saw it, a faint orange glow burning far down the valley, half hidden by the swirling white pulsing like a wound in the darkness. "That's the drilling site," he breathed, his voice barely audible over the storm. Sentinel barked, once sharp and urgent, and already moving toward the door, or as if he had made the decision before Marcus could. Without thinking, Marcus grabbed his coat, flashlight, and roped the old military training, kicking in automatically. The air that hit him outside was a knife, freezing and chaotic, alive with the fury of the storm. The snow stung his face and filled his footprints as fast as he made them, erasing his path behind him, like the mountain was trying to swallow him whole. "Stay close," he shouted, but Sentinel was already ahead, tail low, cutting a straight path through the white, with the certainty of a compass needle pointing toward disaster. They moved down the trail toward the site, the world a blur of wind and sound. Every few steps, Marcus caught flashes of light through the trees, sparks maybe, or fire, and the faint wail of metal twisting under pressure, a sound he remembered from collapsed buildings in war zones, the groan of structures giving up their fight against gravity. The drilling compound sat at the edge of a ravine, half hidden behind a line of frozen trees bent under the weight of snow. As they approached, a massive noise erupted, the sharp snap of something breaking deep below the surface, followed by a shudder that ran through the ground like a seizure. The earth sagged visibly, and Marcus watched in horror as a section of the site collapsed into the ravine, taking scaffolding and equipment with it in a cascade of snow and twisted metal. Sentinel barked wildly, circling back to pull at Marcus's sleeve with his teeth, trying to drag him away from the edge. "I see it," Marcus said, his voice tight with fear and adrenaline. Ahead through the storm, a figure waved weakly from the pit, an orange reflective jacket barely visible against the churning white. "Help down here," the voice rasped, desperate and fading. Marcus stumbled forward, his boots sinking into the snow until he reached the edge of the collapse. He dropped to his knees, peering down into the chaos. Another form moved beside the first man, a second worker half buried in slush and broken equipment, his leg trapped under a twisted beam. Marcus's mind raced. No one else was coming. No trucks, no lights, no rescue teams. Cascadia had pulled out, abandoning their men to the storm and the mountain's revenge. He clenched his jaw, anger and determination flooding through him. "Hang on," he yelled down, his voice barely carrying over the wind. He tied the rope to a nearby pipe jutting from the snow, testing its strength with his full weight before tossing the other end down into the pit. "Can you grab it?" The first man tried, slipping on the icy slope, coughing violently as snow filled his lungs. Marcus scanned the area, his tactical mind assessing options, calculating risks. Then he turned to Sentinel. "Rex, dig." The German shepherd lunged into the snow without hesitation, powerful paws flinging white bursts aside in rapid, efficient strokes. His muzzle disappeared into the drift teeth, clamping onto the man's jacket sleeve with the precision of a tool designed for exactly this purpose. The worker gasped as Sentinel pulled inch by agonizing inch until Marcus could reach down and grab the man's arm. Together, they dragged him up onto solid ground, his body collapsing immediately, breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. The man's face was pale and raw from cold, his lips tinged blue. "Tommy," he panted, his voice shaking. "Tommy's still down there. His leg is stuck." The words dissolved into shivers that racked his entire frame. Marcus wrapped his coat around the man, the wind immediately biting through his flannel shirt, and turned back to the hole. The second man, younger, maybe 23, was deeper in the wreckage, pinned under a metal beam that jutted from the collapsed structure at an angle. Steam rose from a broken hydraulic line nearby, the smell of oil and earth mixing with the snow in a nauseating cloud. Marcus slid down into the pit, landing beside the trapped worker with a controlled fall that sent pain shooting through his old knee injury. The young man's eyes were wide with fear, his skin pale beneath a shock of blonde hair matted with snow and sweat. "Easy," Marcus said, his voice calm despite the chaos. "We're getting you out." He wedged the flashlight between two rocks to free his hands and braced his shoulder against the beam, feeling the cold metal burn through his shirt. "Sentinel," he called, his voice firm. The dog scrambled down beside him, paws slipping on the icy slope before finding purchase. Marcus pushed against the beam with everything he had, his muscles screaming in protest, the old war injury in his back flaring white-hot. "One more," he shouted through gritted teeth. Sentinel barked once and began digging frantically under the edge of the beam, clawing snow and debris away from the young man's trapped leg with desperate efficiency. Finally, the metal gave way just enough, shifting with a groan that echoed through the ravine. Marcus pulled the worker free in one swift motion, the young man crying out in pain as his leg came loose. Together, they climbed back up Marcus, half carrying the injured man, while Sentinel led the way, finding footholds in the treacherous slope that Marcus couldn't see through the blinding snow. When they reached the top, the first worker was sobbing with relief, his hands shaking as he reached out to help pull his companion to safety. Marcus dragged both men toward an abandoned work truck parked near the edge of the site, its engine cold but its cab offering shelter from the wind. He pulled open the door and held them inside, handing over his thermos of coffee and the spare wool blanket from his pack. The heater didn't work, but it was better than the open storm. "We'll wait it out here," Marcus said, his breath coming in short, visible bursts. Sentinel sat by the open door watching the ridge, his fur caked with snow and ice, his amber eyes still alert despite the exhaustion. The rescued man, who introduced himself through chattering teeth as Trenton Walsh kept looking at Marcus with an expression caught between disbelief and gratitude. "You came from the cabin, didn't you?" His voice shook, partly from cold, partly from shock. "I saw your dog last week near the ridge road. They told us the drilling was safe. Said it was just groundwater extraction routine work. But it wasn't, was it?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He stared through the windshield at the storm swirling outside, at the faint glow from the collapsed site, now dimming as the fire beneath was smothered by snow. "No," he said, finally, his voice quiet and certain. "It wasn't." He looked at Sentinel, who lifted his head slightly, eyes bright in the darkness, and felt something settle in his chest, something that had been loose and broken for 12 years. "It's something alive, and they nearly killed it." By dawn, the storm began to break, the wind dying to a whisper, and the snow falling in gentle, deliberate flakes instead of violent sheets. The world outside lay buried in white silence, pristine and terrible. Helicopters thudded faintly in the distance. Rescue teams from the county, drawn by the emergency signals the workers had managed to send before the collapse. Reporters would later call it a miracle, their cameras capturing footage of a veteran and his German shepherd pulling men from an avalanche zone in sub-zero temperatures. The headlines would read, "Navy SEAL veteran and dog save lives in blizzard collapse." But as Marcus stood outside the truck watching the sun rise over the ridge and paint the snow in shades of gold and blue, he wasn't thinking about headlines or recognition. The snow shimmered in the morning light, and from deep within the mountain came a faint hum, slower now, weaker than before, like a heartbeat struggling to continue. The blue line was still alive, but barely. Sentinel pressed against Marcus's leg, ears pinned forward, gaze fixed on the ridge with an intensity that suggested he understood more than any human ever could. Marcus placed a hand on the dog's head, feeling the warmth of life beneath the cold, dusted fur. "We're not done, partner," he murmured, his voice carrying into the vast silence of the mountain morning. The wind picked up his words and carried them upward toward the stone and snow, where the mountains seemed to listen with the patience of something that had waited decades for someone to finally hear. Part 3, Redemption Fire. The snow on Silver Ridge began to melt under the first real warmth of early spring, though winter still clung to the higher elevations like a memory refusing to fade. Days after the rescue, the mountain no longer roared with storms. Instead, it whispered a steady hum, echoing faintly beneath the thawing ground, the sound of something alive struggling to reclaim its rhythm. Marcus stood on the porch of the cabin, his olive field jacket unbuttoned for the first time in weeks, breathing in clean air that carried both the scent of wet pine and the promise of new beginnings. Sentinel sat beside him, tail sweeping softly across the wooden floorboards, his amber eyes scanning the valley below, where the first patches of green were beginning to emerge through the retreating snow. From the distance came the rumble of engines, not drilling this time, but official trucks and survey vans heading toward the Cascadia site. The collapse had triggered a state investigation, and the mountain was suddenly crawling with inspectors, engineers, and federal officials who had ignored Louise Brennan's warnings for 30 years, but could no longer ignore the evidence buried in snow and stone. By mid-morning, a black SUV pulled up the rough track to the cabin, its tires crunching over gravel and slush. A man stepped out tall and dignified despite his age, moving with the careful precision of someone whose joints protested but whose will remained unbroken. Commissioner Daniel Reed was in his late 50s with neatly combed gray hair and a weathered face marked by years of public service in counties where budgets were tight and problems were endless. His deep-set eyes were tired yet kind, framed by lines that suggested a man who had seen too many promises broken and still tried to make things right. "Mr. Brennan," Reed said, stepping onto the porch with a slight nod of respect, "you've caused quite a stir, but you also saved lives and possibly this mountain." His tone carried both respect and quiet amazement, as if he still couldn't quite believe what had happened. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled in the hearth as Reed unfolded documents on the old wooden table, smoothing them with hands that had signed too many compromises and were now perhaps signing something that mattered. "Cascadia Water Solutions operations are suspended indefinitely," Reed said, his voice carrying the weight of official authority. "The company's executives are under federal review for illegal extraction and environmental negligence. The men you rescued, including Trent and Walsh, gave sworn statements that matched your aunt's findings exactly. Core samples from the drill site confirmed that they were extracting from a pressurized aquifer at depths that violate every state and federal regulation on the books." Marcus exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing for the first time in weeks, muscles releasing tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. "So it's over?" he asked, though his voice suggested he knew better than to believe in easy endings. Reed nodded, but his expression remained serious. "For them, yes. For you, maybe it's just beginning." He glanced toward the basement trapdoor, its edges now reinforced with steel plates installed by state engineers to prevent collapse. "Your aunt left behind something more than research, Mr. Brennan. She left responsibility. That water source beneath this mountain, it's not just geologically significant. It's functionally irreplaceable. If it fails, the entire valley ecosystem collapses within a decade." Later that afternoon, Judith Warren returned to the ridge, her parka unzipped, despite the lingering chill snow melting from her gray hair, eyes bright despite the exhaustion of days spent coordinating with state geologists and hydrologists. She brought along two assistants, young scientists in their 30s. One a red-headed woman with freckles and an infectious enthusiasm. The other a quiet man with dark skin and careful hands, both carrying cases of monitoring equipment up the trail with the reverence of people handling sacred relics. "Pressure is stabilizing," Judith said as she adjusted the new digital sensors installed around the crack in the basement chamber floor. Her voice carried relief and wonder in equal measure. "The blue line is still flowing, but it's delicate. One wrong disturbance, one more unauthorized drill, and it could dry up for good. The recovery margin is narrower than I'd like, but it's there." Marcus nodded, standing in the doorway of the chamber, watching the faint blue glow pulse gently in the darkness. "Then we'll protect it," he said simply. He looked at the cabin, at the old beams and creaking roof, at the round window, where Louise had once watched the storms roll in across the valley, and for the first time since inheriting this place, he saw not just a burden, but a promise, a purpose, something worth the staying. News crews arrived in the following days, their vans struggling up the muddy roads, cameras pointed toward the ridge like pilgrims seeking proof of miracles. Headlines spoke of the living vein beneath Silver Ridge and the veteran who turned his family cabin into a water conservation outpost. Marcus gave only one brief interview, standing beside Judith and Commissioner Reed on the porch sentinel, sitting calmly at his feet. "This isn't about me," Marcus said, his voice steady and deliberate, each word measured. "It's about listening to what nature's been saying all along and finally answering it." The reporters scribbled notes, cameras clicking, but Marcus's eyes remained on the ridge, on the stone and snow that held Louise's life's work. Sentinel stood by his side throughout, calm and dignified, the wind brushing through his silver-gray fur as if anointing him guardian of the mountain. Weeks later, when the restoration work was complete and the last of the illegal drill sites had been sealed and monitored, a small crowd gathered for the dedication ceremony. The cabin had been carefully restored, part home and part conservation station, with solar panels discreetly installed on the south-facing roof and a small weather station recording data that fed directly to the USGS. The basement now served as an official monitoring chamber for the Blue Line, its faint glow visible through a reinforced glass panel installed in the floor, eternal and patient. Judith spoke first, her voice echoing softly across the snow-covered clearing. "This place will remind us that silence can carry truth if we care enough to listen. Louise Brennan spent 40 years trying to tell us something we refused to hear. We won't make that mistake again." Then Commissioner Reed stepped forward to unveil a bronze plaque mounted near the cabin steps. The metal gleamed in the low spring sun, engraved with words that would outlast all of them. Louise Brennan Memorial Aquifer Station. For those who listen, 1956 to 2024, protector of the Blue Line. Marcus stood quietly through it all, hands deep in the pockets of his field jacket, watching the small crowd of local scientists and officials who had come to witness this moment. When the speeches ended and the crowd began to disperse, he took out his old pocket knife, the one he had carried through 2 deployments and a dozen highway jobs, and knelt by the wooden step leading up to the porch. Slowly, carefully, he carved 3 words into the weathered grain, the blade cutting deep enough to last decades. Listen, protect, remember. Sentinel watched from beside him, head tilted slightly, his breath forming small clouds in the cool air. As Marcus finished the last letter, he sat down on the step, the knife still in his hand, and the dog laid his head across Marcus's leg with a sigh of contentment. The sky glowed gold behind the peaks, the light scattering across the melting snow and turning the world into something briefly perfect. Somewhere deep inside the ridge, a gentle murmur rose, the same sound Louise had once called the mountain's breath. It wasn't loud, but it carried through the air like a song known only to those who had earned the right to hear it. Marcus looked toward the valley, toward the world he had once felt exiled from, and smiled faintly, the expression foreign on his face but not unwelcome. "We did it, Louise," he murmured, his voice breaking slightly before he caught himself. "Your work is safe now." Sentinel blinked slowly, his amber eyes glinting in the fading light, as if in agreement, as if he had known all along how this would end. The hum deepened, rolling like distant thunder under calm skies, a sound that vibrated through the stone and into their bones. The mountain was breathing again, steady and alive and grateful. Marcus leaned back against the porch post, closing his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. For the first time in 12 years since Cooper died in the sand, and Marcus learned what it meant to fail someone who trusted you, peace didn't feel like a memory or a lie. It felt real. It felt earned. It felt like home. Sentinel shifted beside him, adjusting his position so that his warmth pressed against Marcus's side, and together they sat in the gathering dusk, 2 survivors who had found in each other, and in this mountain, something worth the staying. The wind picked up gently, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth, and Marcus opened his eyes to watch the first stars appear in the darkening sky. He thought of Louise alone on this mountain for 40 years, listening to something no one else believed existed, protecting it, with nothing but stubbornness and conviction. He thought of Cooper bleeding out while Marcus made decisions too slow to matter. He thought of all the years he had spent running from the weight of that failure, living in trucks and working jobs that asked nothing of him because he had nothing left to give. And then he thought of Sentinel sitting in the snow a month ago, refusing to leave this place, refusing to let Marcus run one more time. The dog had known something Marcus hadn't, that redemption doesn't come from finding new places to hide. It comes from standing still long enough to hear what you've been running from. "Good boy, Sentinel," Marcus said softly, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Good boy." 6 months passed. Spring turned to summer, and in the valley below the ridge bloomed with wildflowers that hadn't been seen in decades, fed by the restored flow of the Blue Line. Marcus stayed working part-time as a ranger for the State Forestry Service and leading educational tours of the Aquifer Station for school groups and conservation organizations. He learned the names of plants and birds he had never noticed before, learned the rhythms of the mountain's weather, learned how to live in a place instead of just passing through it. Sentinel grew older, his muzzle graying further, his movements a bit slower in the mornings, but he still patrolled the ridge every dawn with the dedication of a soldier on watch. Locals started bringing him treats, good sausages from the butcher in Clearfield, and the dog, after careful inspection, occasionally accepted them with what might have been approval. One evening, Gus Stone stopped by with a bundle of firewood and a bottle of whiskey. They sat on the porch as the sun set, not talking much, just existing in the comfortable silence of men who understood that some things didn't need words. "You planning to stay?" Gus asked, eventually, his voice rough from the whiskey. Marcus looked out at the ridge, at the faint blue glow visible through the cabin window where the monitoring station hummed quietly. "Yeah," he said, "I think I am." Gus nodded, raising his glass slightly. "Good. Mountain needs someone who listens." They drank in silence, the whiskey burning warm, the night settling around them like a blanket. Sentinel lay between them, his eyes half closed, content. One night in late autumn, Marcus went down into the monitoring chamber alone. The air was cool but not cold, the stone walls smooth under his hand as he descended the familiar stairs. The blue light pulsed gently and the cracks stronger, now healthier, the rhythm steady and sure. He sat on the old wooden chair Louise had used, the same chair where she had spent countless hours recording data and writing in her journals, trying to make sense of something the world refused to acknowledge. He placed his hand on the stone floor, feeling the faint vibration beneath the heartbeat of the mountain. "Thank you," he whispered into the darkness, not sure if he was speaking to Louise or the mountain or something larger he didn't have words for. The blue light flickered in response, and for a moment, just a moment, Marcus could have sworn he heard a voice faint and distant, carried on the hum of the stone. "You're welcome, my boy." He sat there for a long time listening to the mountain breathe, feeling the weight of 12 years of running finally lift from his shoulders. When he climbed back up to the main floor, Sentinel was waiting, sitting patiently by the trapdoor, as if he had known Marcus needed this time alone. Together they walked outside into the cold autumn night, the stars brilliant overhead, the Milky Way, a river of light across the black sky. Marcus sat on the porch step, and Sentinel settled beside him, warm and solid and real. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of coming snow, and the mountain hummed its ancient song, a sound that would outlast them all. Marcus thought about the men he had saved in the storm, about Judith and her team working to protect the aquifer, about the children who visited the station, and learned that some things are worth fighting for even when no one believes you. He thought about Louise, who had spent her life listening when everyone else was shouting, and he understood now what she had been trying to teach him through the notebooks and the carved symbols in the hidden chamber, that silence is not emptiness. It is attention, it is presence. It is the space where truth lives, waiting for someone brave enough to stop and hear it. Sometimes miracles don't come with thunder or light. They come in quiet moments, in the courage to care when it would be easier to walk away, in the faith to protect what is pure, even when the world calls you crazy. In the decision to stay when leaving would be simpler. In the trust you place in a loyal friend who refuses to give up on you even when you've given up on yourself. Marcus Brennan came to Silver Ridge to disappear, to add himself to the long list of forgotten men who the world no longer needed. Instead, he found a mountain that remembered an aunt who had left him not just a house but a calling, and a dog who taught him that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is sit down and refuse to run. The blue line flows still deep beneath the Oregon stone, singing its ancient song to anyone willing to listen. And on the ridge above, in a cabin carved into the mountainside, a light burns in the window. Every night, a beacon for those who have lost their way, a promise that some things are worth the staying. Marcus and Sentinel sit together in the gathering, dark guardians of a truth the world almost lost, protectors of a silence that speaks louder than any shout. The mountain breathes around them, steady and eternal, and for the first time in 12 long years, Marcus Brennan breathes with it, finally peacefully home. May God bless every heart that listens, every soul that still believes in the quiet miracles, the loyal companions, the truths that wait in silence for someone brave enough to stay. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Comment what moment stayed with you. And may the Lord bless and keep you, guide your steps when you are weary, and place faithful friends beside you when you need them most. Amen.